Hello my dear friends, how is it going? I'm Mari Thurger and today I'm here for a very quick discussion, nothing too elaborate as I don't want to waste much of your time. I've decided to make this video because, well, mostly as a quick response to the latest video I've done concerning the black sun symbol and the 12 rays on that same symbol, which many people, or quite a few, have pointed out that it could be a pagan theme, a pagan interpretation, because of the 12 knights of the Holy Grail, the 12 Aesir gods, the 12 Olympian gods, the 12 sons of Odin, and so on and so forth. Because I've stated in that video that the number 12 there, implicit, isn't pagan at all, but a Judeo-Christian religious theme. And since we are very much dealing with a symbol created in the 1930s by the Nazis, the occultic meanings and the religious perceptions behind the symbol are very much Christian and not pagan. Although indeed some people pointed out the 12 Aesir Norse gods and even the idea of the 12 sons of Odin. I'm going to be brief and I'm going to deliver this in one take from the top of my head because we are really not dealing with a pagan theme, right? A pagan interpretation. I'm going to give you a couple of facts so you can have some basis and then you can search by yourselves, because I'm really not here trying to deceive you. I'm trying to help because I too have passed through these doubts and had the same questions and I still have, and there's really a lot of crap out there that we should avoid because it's a bloody waste of time. And the more time you spend properly addressing these subjects and less time focusing on the rubbish, the faster you get where you want to go. I think we can all agree that our objective is to evolve and to obtain proper knowledge that helps us to evolve and that may help us to achieve our objectives. So certain things should be avoided because it will only drag us down or it will only have us stuck and stagnated. So here we go. I've been a YouTuber for 6 years now. And unlike in my professional field as an archaeologist, as most or almost 80% of my work is dealing with the dead, YouTube has given me the opportunity to talk with a variety of different people, living ones, many questions, many answers, we have been exchanging knowledge, many different points of view. It's wonderful. So I think the problem, or at least it seems to me that the problem is that for most of us neo-pagans, modern heathens, animists such as myself, sometimes we don't fully grasp the extent of Abrahamic religious beliefs in our cultures, especially our Western cultures. Sometimes we don't fully understand and perceive the extent of such religious influences upon our societies, especially Christian influences. Sometimes what seems to be pagan isn't actually pagan. And I know there's the current or recurrent idea or belief that Christians have borrowed a lot of pagan themes and conceptions, and I've been there as well. But when we deal with reality, with the historical and archaeological sources, even the myths and folklore, things are much different. Unfortunately, Christianization constituted a clear break in pagan history, religiosity and cultures, and paganism was first rediscovered in the modern era and redesigned in the Romantic period, only to be remade again in the contemporary era, often in the wake of the New Age movements. There have been many changes through history, and the vast majority of sources we have on paganism, especially literary ones, are not pagan constructions, but in most cases Christian interpretations of what paganism may have been or what pre-Christian religions were according to Christians. The more or less conspicuous integration of pre-Christian traditions into the Christian world cannot be taken as an indication of a non-Christianity of a particular people, nor of being pagan. There are a lot of things that we think are pagan, but we are not sure where paganism really ends and where Christianity begins. Religious syncretism is quite normal. And it is normal to recover or incorporate elements from various cults because no religion is born out of nothing. But it is perfectly natural to incorporate elements that merge in such a way that it is even very difficult to understand religious and cultural divisions. In fact, if we could go back in time, we would understand that technically no religion actually exists because they all adopted different traditions and have been formed through time and layers of different beliefs and traditions. There isn't one original religion born out of nothing. Every religion, including paganisms of the past, have borrowed several elements and conceptions from other different belief systems. Now, there is this idea of 12 Aesir gods, and it isn't an idea coming from Scandinavian heathen past, but a medieval literary construction as well. Studying earlier mythological accounts, place names, archaeological evidences, as well as local folklore that shows us concrete evidences of worship towards deities or towards entities that were actually considered gods in the Scandinavian late Iron Age and early medievalism, the Old Norse gods of such periods were no more than 7, 3 of which not considered Aesir and 1 neither Aesir nor Vanir: Odin, Thor, Njordr, Freyr, Freya, Ullr, and Tyr. And pay close attention to what I've just said. Concrete evidences of entities that were considered deities and cults, worship, concrete religious manifestations towards the so-called Norse gods, we have 7 at least that we can find evidences of their worship, cults, sacred places, a clear indication that these were considered gods to the pre-Christian late Iron Age Scandinavians. The later sources and skaldic poetry present the name of other deities, which we find no evidences of their cults or any religious approach towards them, most of them being poetic embellishments, others probably of local older worship, others like Nerthus from different parts of the Germanic cultural world outside Scandinavia that are often placed within the Norse pantheon in contemporary studies. And then there is Loki, who was not a deity, not worshipped, but quite the popular spirit of the hearth, weather, the heat, among other things, remaining in folklore and traditional magic, at least in Denmark, until quite late into the modern period, and presents characteristics of a cultural hero rather than considered a deity. The popularity of Loki earned this spirit a considerable place in the myths precisely to bring in the cultural hero, the domestic spirit of the hearth. I've done a video about this as well, with clear evidences to support my statements and bibliography at the end of that video. And I know some of you nowadays consider Loki a deity, and you worship Loki or include Loki in your cults, spiritual approaches, religious behaviors, etc. And I respect that. That's your personal gnosis, which may be unverified personal gnosis if we are dealing with the history of a people and of a period, but it is not unverified to you because you have had your own experiences with entities and you have your own knowledge on the matter. And I respect that. And in fact, I have expressed my beliefs and my position and opinion towards personal gnosis, be that unverified or verified, on a very recent video. However, if we are going to deal with historical evidences, things are different. The evidences are different. Now, the idea of 12 gods became quite famous in the Middle Ages to match Judeo-Christian biblical accounts, as the number 12 is quite important in such religious backgrounds, mainly the 12 disciples of Christ. Despite the seemingly isolation of Iceland, it was never truly isolated from mainland European cultural developments. And its politicians and scholars were very much aware of the religious and cultural developments in continental Europe, especially the Renaissance, which gave origins later on to the very Icelandic magic staves. There was this ongoing idea that the pagan gods were false, but they could not be totally wiped out for the sake of facilitating the religious transitions into Christianity, by trying to keep it peaceful and integrate people, which is why religious syncretism was of the utmost importance and was the key element to facilitate the conversion. In fact, The early stages of Christianity for many centuries throughout the early Middle Ages, in several cultural and geographical realities, not all of them but several, was actually a process of integration, and pagans were allowed to even build their temporary temples next to the church and have their pagan festivities on the church's grounds. And there was this incorporation of religious elements being fused together. This isn't something that was unique or exclusive to Christianity, mind you. Pagans did this all the time as well, fusing religious elements, adding other gods, other cultures, other materials. A local village or community would have a god or gods they preferred, and then the gods of other localities or of other people got connected to their own gods and other gods, which is a form of communication and even creating beneficial alliances and symbiotic relationships with others, with other individuals, other humans, if anything, for the sake of survival. Christians knew this as well, and they knew the importance of this approach and the importance of religious and cultural syncretism. They had the previous Roman model, which facilitated the integration of people or several peoples into the empire, into a new political and military administration. Even though there were several conflicts, indeed, this model of religious syncretism was quite diplomatic and avoided 100 times more conflicts than the ones that actually took place. Christians didn't just come into uncharted territory saying, your gods suck, you suck, and this place stinks, you all need Jesus. In the best case scenario, they would be beaten to death, and things would not have worked out as best as they have. But as I was saying, there was this ongoing idea that the pagan gods were false, but they could not be totally wiped out. Therefore, many gods were included in new medieval writings, but not as gods anymore. We have the case of Saxo Grammaticus, who took away the divine elements of the gods and turned them into legendary heroes. Saxo Grammaticus is a very useful source to understand the passage, or one of the passages, from paganism into Christianity in Northern Europe. And these literary sources played a fundamental role to make that passage possible and very smoothly. Saxo Grammaticus is literally a study on how to kill gods. He stripped away the divinity of the Norse gods, transformed them into mortal, legendary heroes. As such, the Norse gods ceased to be gods at all and began to be seen as heroes, mortal heroes. And these accounts were fundamental to convey religious messages to the majority of the general public, showing that after all the gods were not truly gods, but heroes, mortal men, maintaining their renown and importance, not offending the old gods, not offending the people, but turning them into mortal heroes instead, and expressing the message that the true God was only one, the Christian God, and all the previous gods were, after all, mortal heroes, famous legendary heroes. Therefore, no need to worship them, therefore the religious thought should instead be channeled towards the actual divinity of Christendom. This is quite clever. Now, Saxo Grammaticus was a contemporary of Snorri Sturluson, the Icelandic Christian who wrote the Prose Edda, which is the main source for evidences on Old Norse mythology. He also very much reinforced the idea of 12 gods, or there was this ongoing idea of 12 deities. Even though half of the gods he speaks of were not considered gods in heathen times, and he dismisses other names which, if considered gods, would be more than 20 deities. Snorri did not totally invent the content he wrote, as one of his main sources of inspiration was the Völuspá, which is a poem of the 10th century probably, written by an unknown author or authors, and judging by the content, it already shows heavy Christian influences. And whoever wrote the Völuspá was very much aware of biblical accounts, which demonstrates it was probably someone who administered a church, or a priest, or a clergyman, clerical worker. But the pagan content is also still there. But Snorri's idea of 12 gods, or this formation of 12 gods, comes from the Christian rewritings and interpretations of classical Greek myths that were being produced in mainland Europe in the Middle Ages. We also start to see by this period the same idea of 12 gods, but of the Olympus. You see, what was going on around this period was also a development of occult or occultic teachings showing the old gods as false gods and turning them into 12 disciples of sorts of the one god, and placing these gods on a high place to convey the idea of a legendary spot that is sacred above all others. Which is why Olympus was thus reinterpreted as this place with the 12 gods, and why Snorri turned Asgardr into this idea of heaven and placing in it the 12 gods as well. In heathen times, Asgardr was not considered a heaven, but a place of a tiny group of deities. And there were other places of other deities and several other worldly realms and places solely for the dead and places solely for other beings. This is also the reason for the 12 Knights of the Round Table, the Knights of the Holy Grail, in Arthurian legends. Arthurian legends, despite having been inspired by pagan Welsh, Scottish and Irish myths and legends, were actually first written down in the 12th century by Geoffrey of Monmouth, a tradition followed by other authors who further Christianized even more the Arthurian legends. I've already done a video about Merlin and very much about the origins of Merlin and the Arthurian legends, and if you have the time and if you think you should take a look at that, please watch the video and you will surely understand how much of a Christian religious structure and Christian morality the Arthurian legends express. The idea of 12 gods is a Christian medieval construction of mostly of the Renaissance period, consolidated in the Renaissance period and periods before, which has been constantly reinforced. Snorri Sturluson, as I've said this many times, composed his work 200 years after Christianity became the official religion of Iceland. Becoming the official religion of Iceland doesn't mean the people were converted by force. It means that Christianity in previous centuries was already within the Nordic society. It was implemented in several social and cultural and even religious pockets. When Christianity finally became the official religion of Iceland, it was thus accepted as such by the General Assembly because it made sense to them at that period, because most people in Iceland were either already Christians or pagans who already had several Christian religious elements and conceptions and attitudes in their lives, in their daily lives. Snorri was a Christian writing for Christians. And even though we see many pagan themes in his work, we also clearly see the construction of a mythology to express Christian teachings and Christian religious elements a lot more familiar to Snorri. So 12 gods is a Christian conception. We see this progressive attitude to transform Asgardr into the equivalent of the Christian heaven, and Odin becoming the king of the gods all of a sudden. The father of the gods, a reflection of the Christian God in heaven and the king of heaven, and as the father of the legendary heroes, mortal heroes that were once gods or demigods. We see this same interpretation in the Christian reinterpretation of classical myths, most specifically the myths of the Hellenic cultural world. And again, this idea of the 12 Olympian gods, 12 disciples, 12 legendary figures in a high place, 12 knights, 12 tribes, and so on and so forth. The recurrent occultic Renaissance idea of a high sacred place above all others, using the pagan myths not as material to express an accurate historical study of ancient religions, but as evidences to express that even the pagans already knew about the Christian teachings and morals before Christ. To legitimize Christianity, constructing this idea that even the pagan ancestors of the Christians were already familiar with Christian teachings and morals. That was one of the main objectives of Snorri Sturluson, not to safekeep pagan knowledge, but to express this idea that his pagan ancestors were already familiar with Christian religious teachings and morals, by very much making a reinterpretation of the myths and adding elements, and also ignoring several others to express what he wanted to express. And he wanted very much to follow the current religious and occultic ideas of his own time, especially of continental Europe, transforming Asgard, for instance, into a heavenly place where Odin rules over all, just as the Christian reinterpretation of Greek myths and the 12 gods of the Olympus. And we can actually see in Snorri's work several influences from classical myths as well, reinterpreted classical myths. And the 12 knights of the Holy Grail, which were said to have their castle among the crags and peaks of northern Spain on Mount Salvart and Mount Moria as well, and Mount Sinai, upon which the tablets of law were given to humankind. All these medieval constructions based on biblical accounts became occultic symbols that were spreading all over Europe and beyond. All these symbols to express an idea, a belief of one universal ideal. And each of these accounts were created in these periods on purpose so that their authors could claim the same religious background, to give it legitimacy, claiming a legendary world or castle or fortress among the clouds, and showing that their ancestors were very much expressing these Abrahamic teachings as well. And these Christian authors were trying to convey this message that their own ancestors, pagan ancestors, had already been onto this longer than the others, trying to seek an ancestral past that could already express Christian morals and religious conceptions, when in reality it was never like that, obviously. But it seems like that because these sources have been purposely altered to express this idea. And so this idea of a sacred place and 12 gods began to also open up the opportunity to construct these religious ideals into the very human societies, giving rise to a variety of occultic groups and organizations that also reflect these same ideals on Earth. Brotherhoods of 12 members, symbols representing the number 12, and these ideals of a higher place or a higher phase or a point of illumination. So this also makes us think about the 12 Aesir gods, which were never 12. Based on several evidences, we have at least 7 deities that were actually worshipped by Scandinavians. And if we count with all the other names of other entities that come in the sources, literary sources, we end up with more than 20 seemingly gods, even those gods whose names in the sources, especially in skaldic poetry, really show us that they are not gods but poetic embellishments, or to convey a message or a moral or literally metaphors. Gods that we find nowhere else except in poetry. And what about the 12 sons of Odin? Well, I've never once seen in the sources the idea of 12 sons of or 12 children of Odin. This is the same idea spoken previously, extended to our current or modern times. This continuous Judeo-Christian religious conception around the number 12. Looking at the sources, if we really want to look for gods that were the sons of Odin and really pushing it and pulling it and stretching too far to look for a magical number of sons of Odin, we find a total of 9 gods perhaps. And that is really pushing it too far without any regard for historical and archaeological accuracy and denying the evidences as well as ignoring a lot of material. Without counting with the sources that mention mortal man, legendary kings and heroes who are said to be the sons of Odin, solely looking for gods, there's Thor, Balder, Vidar, Vali, Heimdallr, Bragi, Tyr, Hodr and Hermodr. But this is really ignoring a lot of important evidences. Of all these 9 gods, we really have evidences for the Scandinavian Iron Age of the worship of 2 of them. But again, information for this depends very much on which, let's say, which mythological layer we are dealing with, because the mythological accounts have changed quite a lot all the time, and there are even different variations in the same period and in the same contexts. And again, the larger body of evidences for Old Norse mythology is the youngest of sources, the Christianized medieval interpretation of what Norse beliefs may have been according to Christians, in which Odin indeed is portrayed as a father of about every deity and hero the Christians could find evidences for, and that's it, case closed. Odin is the father of all, that's it, he is the pagan version of our beloved one true god. However, looking back at the actual Scandinavian Iron Age, Odin was far from being the patriarch of the gods, the sky daddy, father of everything that walks on two legs. And we really get the perception that Odin was actually a much younger deity when compared to other long existing gods and established cults to such older gods. Odin is by no means a Christian invention, mind you, of course, obviously. Odin is a pagan deity, but the greatest impact of Odin in religion comes much later, a few centuries prior to the Viking Age, and in literary sources later still by the end of the Viking Age, and mostly in the early opening of Nordic populations to the European medieval period. The idea of Odin being the father of, let's say, for instance, Bragi, is quite curious because Bragi was a real person elevated to godhood. And due to his outstanding skills in poetry, it is also given a special ancestry. The idea that Odin is the father of Thor, as another example, is something that continues to bother me. It is quite clear in material culture and monuments that Thor is a much older deity than Odin. And I'm sure you have seen that several times by the comparison with countless counterparts the thunder god has in other European mythologies. We see several Slavic, Celtic, Celto-Iberian, Lusitanian, Iberian, Roman deities connected to thunder and the hammer and the fertility symbology associated to them. One day I should like to take you on a trip to see the Galaico or Galician Lusitanian god Larocco, literally an early Iron Age northern western Iberian deity that shows all the evidences of a thunder god of fertility similar to the Celtic Sukeros, to the Nordic Thor, the depiction of Cern Abbas, giant, the erected phallus symbology and the use of the hammer, etc. I'm drifting away from the subject, but I could go on and show you evidences that the late sources telling that just about every male deity is the son of Odin isn't totally true. Hermodr, for instance, another example, is actually the messenger of Odin, just like the Hellenic god Hermes is the messenger of the gods. And we see the parallels here with classical myths being reinterpreted in the Middle Ages. The god Tyr, being the son of Odin, is a joke, in my opinion, because evidences for Tyr appear much earlier than those of Odin. And Tyr was a sun god whose father was a giant or a primordial cosmic being through which the world was created, and many, many other evidences. We really should not see such deities as the actual sons of Odin, at least not understood as such by the actual pagans of the Iron Age, but interpretations that came much later. And I'm not just talking about Christian influences and interpretations, but this also occurred probably among the pagans as well. Again, Odin having many children isn't just Christian interpretation to try to find in Odin the equivalent to the Christian god and almost creating a parallel with Christ himself as if the sons of Odin were the disciples of Christ. But Odin having many sons is also probably a thing that had originated before among pagans as well, due to the merging of myths and belief systems of several different communities and regions. A local community would have a god they worship, or they would prefer or venerated or worshipped more often, or even being the deity of the community. And then with the contact with other groups of people and belief systems, the gods got connected to other gods, creating family relations and giving parenthood to deities precisely to fuse different gods among the communities that got together. But indeed, Odin being the father of so many gods and people was extensively exaggerated in literature, in Christian contexts, and it got out of hand. But this idea of 12 sons of Odin is simply not evident in the sources, and it's just a contemporary idea following the occultic and religious ideals around the number 12, which by itself is also a later medieval conception of the consolidated in the Renaissance period. I'm not saying that Odin would not have children of his own, because it seems that was actually a very important religious background for heathen kings and royalty in general, having an ancestry connected to a specific deity to give them the right to rule, to give them legitimacy, to give them power, that extra element of divine power on earth. This isn't something exclusive to the Christian kings and queens of Europe who were believed to be in positions of power, ruling over people because they were ordained by God. Pagans did this too. And we find many evidences of long lineages of heathen Swedish kings who have claimed to be descendant of Freyr or Frodi or Yngvi or some other fertility god. The same thing happens with Odin, and being the father of a line of kings is the very background of the Völsungasaga, a huge family tree claiming ancestry all the way back to Odin himself, to give that extra legitimacy and connection to a powerful god. This was something recurrent among many pagan peoples as well, and in fact beliefs about the human descendancy of the gods appear to be extremely ancient also within Germanic cultural contexts, as shown in the work Germania by Tacitus from the 1st century of the Common Era. But 12 sons of Odin and 12 Aesir gods, not so much. That's a Judeo-Christian religious interpretation, and we are also face to face with Abrahamic occultic ideals and the occultic imaginary of the Middle Ages, especially since the Renaissance onwards. It consolidated in the Renaissance period in Europe. Well, my dear friends, this was just a general view, so you may have a little bit of content so you can explore even more. Sometimes we really have no perception of the extent of Abrahamic religious and cultural influences in our cultures, even in cultures that seem to predate Christianity, but the contents that reach us have been very much altered by such religious backgrounds, especially Christianity. And it isn't hard to understand why. Paganisms and animistic belief systems have lasted for thousands of years, but people were not very much concerned with recording their beliefs, as the knowledge was mostly passed on through oral tradition. There are a few depictions on stone, surely, of course, but it wasn't a widespread habit, and we have to take into account the technology and the evolution of utensils and materials to record something on a surface that not only would last, but it could also be easily passed on to others. Christianity already comes in a moment when the written word was far more common and widespread. Other mentalities, other technologies. I mean, the first book to be printed in Europe was the Bible, so Christianity really took great advantage of this new technology and means of spreading knowledge. But even before that, hundreds of thousands, millions even, of works were being written down or compiled within Christian monasteries. The power of the spoken and the written word lied with the church, and the written word especially with Christian monks. So, much of the literary sources are either Christian creations or interpretations, or Christian interpretations of older works and having been reinterpreted and compiled by Christians or by Jews, or in the Islamic world by Muslims. Extensively writing wasn't really a pagan thing, unfortunately. And that's one of the main reasons why we have so many works about so many subjects, including about pagan subjects, that haven't been written by pagans, but by peoples with very different religions and mentalities and morals than those of the pagans. I hope I have given you something to think about on the extent of Abrahamic religious and cultural influences in our societies, and what seems to be pagan sometimes really isn't. By all means, keep those comments coming, questions, answers, exchange of knowledge. It's a wonderful thing. I didn't even plan on doing this video. Actually, this video wasn't planned at all. I'm just here talking. We are having a discussion, a conversation. But I find it very useful, this exchange of knowledge that we are having, and it seems that it helps to create content and food for thought. So, by all means, express yourself. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you for your time. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Farewell, my dear friends.